Welcome to Edel Assanti. Thank you all for coming and being so punctual. For those of you for whom this is not the first Gordon Cheung talk at Edel Assanti, welcome back. And for those of you for whom it is the first, you're in for a treat. We have staged 4 shows with Gordon in an almost 10-year-long relationship, and I have confidence when I say that this is the most ambitious of those 4. Since we've worked with Gordon, long since we've worked with Gordon, he's an artist who's been described in these sort of dualities. The terms dystopia and utopia are often thrown at him at the same time. He has often tried to sort of make work that's about the spaces that are really new and that are emerging, from when he was at art school to trying to capture the information age to the present day, and this exhibition where he's examining very closely new geographies in China and the Greater China area that have really emerged in the last decade, some of them, and that's the landscapes that you're surrounded by. Who better to take you through these challenging landscapes than Mark Rappolt? For those of you that don't know Mark is the editor-in-chief of Art Review, and he's also probably the best travelled art writer, curator that I know, especially in Southeast Asia. And in fact, in 2013, Mark launched Art Review Asia, which is one of the first originally Western art publications to focus specifically on targeting an Asian audience. So hopefully this is a great meeting of the minds, and without further ado, I give you Mark on board.
Thank you. So I thought, after all the nice talk about utopia and dystopia, maybe we should start with how these paintings are created and talk about perversion to some degree. Because there's a perverse way that you take data, the newspaper data of markets and stocks, and then you overlay it with a kind of, which is the ground for the paintings, and then you overlay it with a kind of quasi-romantic, idealized landscape imagery, and then also superimposed data mapping infrastructural networks in Greater China over the top again. And I wonder how those two things, the sort of slightly romantic, maybe sci-fi portrayal, and the sort of data analysis to some degree, fit together.
It's a response, I suppose, to the way how the narratives that we build in respect to how we perceive the world is through mythologies and stories, sort of fictional realities. And these kind of stories bind us or help unite us in order to be able to then pursue bigger projects. And so the biggest project is Civilizations. So using originally from 1995, I suppose, I started using the stock listings of the Financial Times in reference to this information space that we found ourselves in. So it was the communications and digital revolution. And so I felt that this was our new landscape that I wanted to capture while at art school, because I found it incredibly profound and compelling to try and find a way to visualize it.
And I guess in these works which tackle Greater China or Hong Kong and China, depending where you sit, there's also a relationship to Hong Kong that's colonial. That is very much about numbers and profits. And it has a particular resonance in these works.
So even back in the 90s, it was the dominant economic model of what is capitalism. And so around 1997 was the handover, and I immediately made a piece of work. I remember I was in the living room of my student flat, and I grabbed hold of these large cans and started shredding them, because they had these kind of Arcadian landscapes of China with this sort of beautiful image of a factory pumping out smoke. And I like that sort of disparity between those two sort of what should be sort of contradictory sort of imagery. And Hong Kong, of course, was something back then I didn't really understand, even though my parents are from there, as being a colony. And so all this imagery of the handover and the importance that was given to it, going back to China, it took probably another 15 more years before I started to realize some of the histories, if you like, behind that, and that's what I've started sort of looking at more in depth with this recent body of work.
So you were talking earlier about how stories are what unites us. And obviously in these paintings, as a representative of the Chinese government, I might say that it's infrastructure and railway systems and communication systems that unites us. So maybe you could describe the systems that you've mapped out in these paintings.
Sure.
And then we can debate about which thing unites us.
So the show sort of begins with these two paintings that are probably the widest perspective in respect to the towers of water, which is the Tibetan plateau, and the river systems, the main river systems that China is beginning to dam up. And those that rely on the rivers downstream, China will have political leverage over. It's also to supply, obviously, the hydroelectric sort of demands. And in each of the paintings, actually, there's a sacred mountain.
Yeah.
And so these sacred mountains, a set of 5, was traditionally what the emperor would visit in order to sanctify his divine rights to rule over his subjects. And so the other painting on the other side, String of Pearls, is actually a term that's devised by a US military contractor to define, if you like, a narrative to suggest that China's infrastructural investment in these ports along the maritime Silk Road is one of offense and defense, and for trade and energy purposes. But obviously China denies that and says that it's to do with connecting trade routes and to maintain good relations or strengthen relations between the nations in which they're investing in. And then as we move up further, you get more specifically closer to China's infrastructure sort of projects. So for example, the title painting of the show, Tears of Paradise, is of the Pearl River Economic Zone. And it's about 9 districts that are connected by high-speed rail, 22 million people, and worth about 20% GDP of China's economy. And then at the top is the One Belt, One Road, which is a map of the nations that are being connected by trade agreements by China. So it's the largest human project.
And it also involves infrastructure developments.
And infrastructure investments.
Curious extensions of Chinese legal dominions.
Chinese
Well, in the sense that a lot of the laws that govern these developments
are
Chinese law, even if they happen to be in the Pacific Islands or Africa.
Right. And they also bring in their own workforce and so on into those projects. And often working with nations that the West won't work with in that, to the extent that China's investing into those nations as well, because they don't, for perhaps geopolitical reasons, in order to keep them in a certain status or condition, they'd rather have them in a weakened position as opposed to one in which there is significant infrastructure being built and for their economies to also thrive. Now, it's depending on each nation that they've invested in and depending on the political systems that they have in place and the leaderships and the amount of corruption in those places is being, there have been successes and failures.
And do you think these structures are shifting the global geopolitics as much as the local ones?
I mean, it's what's being talked about for a number of decades now, about this rise or return of China and the way that they seem to be enacting policies that are more about strengthening trade or mutual trade between nations. Now, there's a number of reasons, in some ways for that, because they were the manufacturing hub of the world, and now that their middle classes are growing, and now there's a shift towards creating an internal economy, the resources that they need can no longer be solely found within China itself. So they have to, in a way, sort of like extend beyond.
So they're doing grain in Africa and things like this.
Yes, and things like rare earths and so on. But rather than going in and attacking with war and invading and conquering and stealing and so on, they've decided that this has to be to actually work with other nations. So it's possible that because if they did that, they wouldn't be able to fight, against the repercussions of that.
Yeah, which is in some ways very similar to, say, the East India Company. Back in the day, the glory days.
The East India Trade Company, which is actually featured in one of the paintings over there, the String of Pearls. So the boat in the bottom left corner is actually the gunboat Nemesis that was the first to go to China. And so what happened was that during what was to be called the Opium Wars, was that Britain was selling, or East India Trade Company was smuggling opium into China in exchange for silver that then they...
Because the emperor had forbidden.
Yeah, the emperor had forbidden and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, and she ignored it, and so they burnt a whole load of opium crates, and in response the merchants got very angry, went back to England and said, you need to do something about this. They debated the morality of defending drug smuggling and decided to go to war. And as a result, Hong Kong was given to the British Empire.
Yeah. I think it's interesting in a lot of the works that you've pictured these infrastructure systems as kind of constellations.
Yeah, some of them are as constellations. They
sort of mythologize them a little bit.
Yeah, they kind of like as if they're written in the stars, as if there's a sort of destiny, if you like. It's this kind of convergence of like real structures, but then these real structures are also surrounded by mythologies.
Yeah.
In order to be able to sell these, if you like, these sorts of projects to the people to get them to build them, it has to be for a greater good, if you like, and that's often wrapped up in ideas of becoming greater.
Yeah. And you think that's one of the reasons you put them together with the Sacred Mountains?
Yeah, I was layering sort of different fictional realities, if you like. So, in general, although not in all of the paintings, there's a human scale at the bottom, and then a harnessing of the landscape, and then a sort of divine order or a fictional reality, and then a future space.
And by human scale, you kind of mean the architecture that you depict?
Yeah, so the buildings or the animals at the bottom, the symbol of the home, the unit of the civilization.
But these aren't just any old buildings?
No, they're not. They're so, for example, in Desert of the Real, over on the right here, the building there is a torn down building in Kashgar that China has demolished because the area that I'm depicting in that painting is of northwest China, Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur Muslims are being re-educated, and whereas the West would call it concentration camps. or boarding schools, according to China, and de-extremification centres.
Yeah.
And so it's a particularly sensitive area, so beyond the human rights issue and the way how a civilization or leadership deals with certain minorities, the geopolitical situation in northwest of China is that it's going to be the busiest intersection of the Belt and Road project. It borders 8 nations. One of those nations has invaded China in the past, Russia.
Yeah.
And Russia, or the USSR at the time, in 1949, supported the separatist movement of the Uyghur Muslims in that region. They then abandoned them for favourable terms with China.
Yeah.
And then China repressed the Uyghur Muslims. And over the decades, of course, resentment, and also through internal colonization by the high-speed rail,
Yeah.
which is what's in the sky, the dominant demographics of that region has almost become 42% Uyghur and about 40% Han Chinese, whereas before it was 80-something%.
Which is something that's happening throughout China.
Well, it's happening around places like Tibet as well. So, and again, if we talk beyond the human rights issues, geopolitically, Tibet represents the water towers of Asia.
Yeah.
So and since Tibet is without an army, if a foreign power does take control of that region, they control the water towers and therefore the rivers of China and enormous political leverage over their sovereignty.
Yeah. But it's interesting coming back to sort of statistics and facts and realities when, like I said before, the kind of mythologizing and the kind of maybe like undatifiable characteristics in the work with the sort of landscapes and the sort of constellations somehow also takes stuff away from these realities too. And it's maybe that classic science fiction trope where you want to write about something that's plausible, so therefore quite close to the present, but at the same time slightly unimaginable. And that's what the fiction thing is. Is that something you also try and do in your work?
Yeah, so there is this sort of science fiction aspect to the work, and that is partly because I love science fiction.
I guess I meant kind of structurally rather than literally.
Structurally.
In the sense of like trying to fix this point that's tied to a kind of reality, but kind of abstracted from it at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of enwrapping or tying or weaving facts and histories into a digestible kind of story. It's such an important way of experiencing, our humanity, through stories. And stories or narratives or mythologies and so on, incredibly important aspect, like I said before, which is a way of uniting people under a cause, if you like, in order to be able to build towards these larger projects, these real things.
I think it also speaks a little bit to, so for instance, after Tiananmen Square, a lot of the kind of early fiction about it from the side of the students would go into like, stories of the mountains and beasts, and abstract from the reality to be able to tell the story because it was straight to prison.
But even if we talk about classic Chinese painting, for example, the ink paintings that which will come to mind to anybody that thinks of what Chinese painting is. The mountains represented the state, and so the culture of those painters at the time, the educated elite, they were often people that would work for the emperor. They would be waiting potentially for a position, and so they would use ink painting as a way of recording or codifying their relationship to the state. And so through the poetry that's embedded within the paintings themselves, and also everything else that was written about them, they were able to convey their relationship relationship, how they felt about that particular dynasty that was in control. So in some ways, I'm always saying that all art, in some ways, it has a political aspect to it, whether it's apathy or overtly, suggesting or creating a forum to sort of think about some of those wider important issues.
So when you show this kind of multiply coded language here, so the mountains that people may or may not recognize, the constellations that people probably may not recognize now, but might impact on their lives sometime in the future. Is that the kind of sign of optimism, or do people have to get all these codes in the work?
Well, they can appreciate it on just this aesthetic.
Is that wrong? Is that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. Not at all. I'd be very happy if people enjoyed my paintings just on that level.
Yeah.
But I would hope, a bit like getting to know someone, that as you get deeper and deeper into like how they're actually thinking, what they're thinking about, what they really believe, that it will be a further enriching sort of experience. I don't expect people to get everything in no, of course.
Because I think when we were talking the last time we met, maybe we were talking a little bit how the works are kind of hyperlinked in a way.
Right, yeah, like an interface,
Yeah, and then you go up here, what's that? And that's another story. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons for me that they work as paintings rather than digital images or moving images, which might have been the alternative ways of doing it.
Yeah.
How do you know when too many hyperlinks, when you've got too many of these links? Is there a saturation point?
When I don't do anything else to it, basically. I mean, quite often, a painting will be sitting in the studio and I don't know that it's finished.
Yeah.
Until I realise it is. And then maybe even like years down the line, I want to do more stuff to it or something, So it's in a way, you don't really know. It depends on your mindset and where you think something is finished or deadline.
So do you ever come across a problem where you get an old work back from a collector, say, for a show, and you decide you might want to do a little bit more to it?
I once changed something on a painting with permission from the collector, but
that's just
very, very rarely. Very rarely.
And you also, like, in the way you construct the images with the newspaper, have this kind of slightly pixelated aspect to them.
So that's all back to this notion of an information space that we all exist in, this world in which capital is moving in instantaneously, trillions in an instant, and wherever it accumulates creates dystopias and utopias. So the pixel is the unit, if you like, of that space. It's the atom of that datascape. Something that we're extremely familiar with when we see low resolution JPEG images and so on. So for me, it's this. It is this artificial information space, and the pixel represents that.
But also, I guess the screen is the main way through which we see representations of these infrastructure networks. It's sort of the only way to kind of comprehend them.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're so much of our time now is engaged through the screen, and not only that, but the fact that we're in some ways teleporting through these electronic spaces. When we click on a link, it sends a signal up somewhere and fires it down into a server in the desert, whirs the machine, sends it back to you, and in some ways you're constantly teleporting through those spaces. And so. For me, this is our modernity.
Yeah, that's depressing.
I don't think it's depressing.
No?
I don't actually think it's depressing. No. I just think it's a new way of being. It's not. It doesn't diminish our humanity. It just creates another instrument for us to traverse.
But I guess in these works, there's not many humans.
There isn't. What's the problem with humans? I guess I wanted to create a existential sort of space. And so when you remove the human, you yourself is the one that remains as you're looking into these spaces. And so when you're at the brink of something epic and sublime, The questions of what does it mean to be, who am I, what am I, why am I, are these universal questions of what does it mean to exist. And in some ways that's the question that I'm always asking in respect to, despite the grandeur of these projects, despite the enormity that these are the largest human projects in history, what does it ultimately mean? Is one of the questions that I'm most, I guess, interested in.
Have you answered it?
No, of course not.
Some more works to come.
No, but it does remind me of there was a top 10 regrets that people at their deathbeds, have, and it's not, ever. They never sort of say that I wish I made more money, or I wish I got more stuff. It's usually that they wish they spent more time with their loved ones.
So we've sort of been ignoring the amazing stage set we created for this talk.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about the works that behind us.
As the paintings shift from a wider perspective towards more sort of internal China projects, we reach this installation of traditional Chinese windows that for me represents homes. And so windows, of course, need walls, and here they're invisible, so there's a kind of implied ghost architecture of homes phasing in and out. And they were kind of in response to the rapid urbanization of China. And so many of these sorts of older buildings with these types of windows would be torn down. And so the windows started to conceptually, for me, represent the demarcation between communism to capitalist communism. And of course, there's a lot of romantic sort of narratives around a window, wistfully looking out, and an interior to an exterior. So it had all these kind of resonances that I was interested in. But originally, all of the window designs, they came from a book that I found in a thrift shop in Chinatown about 15 years ago. And at the time, I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. And then about 3-4 years ago, I realized that I wanted to make these.
I remember talking to you about, so I was in Shanghai last year with an artist who wanted to make a kind of cheesy traditional performance based on Chinese opera in a warehouse space. And we went to all these shops now in Shanghai that sell fake versions of antique windows if you want to kind of...
Great, I might get some.
But I guess it's somehow that legacy is also present in China. It's not that sort of symbolism, I guess.
I mean, it's... some of these can look like as though they come from Islamic tradition, or even Greek in some. The designs, the scholars are very few about Chinese traditional windows. But I think it's probably to do with the Silk Roads and the transmission of culture through the Silk Roads, which was basically globalization at the pace of a camel.
I mean, that's an interesting reflection in respect to the paintings too, that they're the fusion of different cultural references. So this one, for instance, might be simultaneously an 18th century classical landscape. As much as it might also be a kind of traditional Chinese classical landscape.
So I was interested, I've always been interested in the tradition of the sublime landscape painting. And
they'd have people like that.
They would have had people with them, they would have a tiny little figure in them that would represent something very different. But also politically or propaganda-wise, they would represent their conqueror. So often those territories are these kind of magnificent virgin worlds, these kind of promised lands in which the tiny figure has discovered. And so erased from that narrative of the landscape is those that would have existed and had always been there.
And I guess there's also this history of landscape painting being about property and ownership, whether it's physical property or intellectual property. And I guess that's something that chimes in with the kind of infrastructure in these things.
Yeah, I guess in particular that piece as well, because there's an internal colonization going on as well.
We're only talking about that piece because that's the one I can see.
Right. Well, we could talk about that piece, which is the merging of three cities into a megalopolis of 130 million people.
Yeah.
But back to the sublime paintings, I was always fascinated by the romantic language of it. So it would be of overwhelming nature to the individual into a kind of terror. And that experience was what brought you close to the experience of God.
Yeah.
And so God was in the force of nature, or the beauty and awe and the sheer overwhelming scale compared to your minute person within the landscape that's almost swallowed up.
Yeah.
But of course, it's also the fact that it was seen as a way of suggesting that all this land has been given to you because you're a believer.
Yeah. And but I guess at the same time, does that mean that in these paintings, the infrastructure networks are the gods?
I mean, maybe. I mean, I did used to think about the stock market in that way as a new god.
Did you used to invest in that?
I failed to invest.
That's why I'm an artist.
That's why I'm an artist, yeah. But it was this notion that we're surrounded by all these numbers. What is omniscient, omnipotent? It's these numbers that affect all of us. And no more sensationally and spectacularly evidenced by the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
There was a 2-week period where we didn't know whether the system itself was going to completely collapse and that we were going to go into an apocalypse of sorts.
Yeah.
I mean, it was this crazy time when it was like the end of capitalism was front page news. And of course things have carried on. But yeah, this idea that these numbers are constantly surrounding us, perhaps in the same way as how divine narratives are constructed.
Yeah. But I guess in the same way that numbers construct the geometries on these window frames.
Right. You mean that?
So one way of seeing them is just as a mathematical pattern.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. It's, I mean, it's...
Particularly when you put them next to these.
Right. But yeah, the numbers have always, the numbers of the stock listings have always been, because it's a dominant, like I said, it's the dominant economic model of, on a global scale.
Yeah.
But when I was a student, it was always talk about globalization, global villages, super information, super highways, and so on. And that's where the geopolitical sort of euphoria came from before we had all the multiple global crashes and so on.
And yet you use that data from a newspaper, which no serious trader would do.
No, they don't use it anymore, it's true, yeah.
And I guess there's this interesting part that maybe not when you first started doing, but now seems part of tradition.
Yeah.
As much as 18th century landscape painting might.
Right. So it's it was at the time a convenient material to use. I was literally using it like a pigment of the paintings themselves. So I would shrink them and pulp them and try to make my own version of the paint.
Yeah.
But that paint was actually information of the very space that I was trying to depict in the work. And no trader uses them now. As soon as you print this information, it's redundant.
Yeah.
So, in fact, it's used for advertising space. That's the primary vehicle for these sorts of pages nowadays.
Yeah.
But I still think it has this kind of, obviously, relationship to that space. It symbolizes that space. Yeah. And that's the reason why I still continue to use this material.
Yeah. And you talked about the things you do in newspaper, and also in the works you do a lot with sand.
Mm.
And now you finally freed yourself to do sculpture.
Yes.
Is that something you've always wanted to do?
I've actually made sculpture, maybe one sculpture per year,
Yeah.
for a while, and
Because
but this is Huh?
Because you're bashful.
Because I'm bashful, maybe. But this is the first, maybe, branch of work, if you like, that is for sure a permanent aspect of how I'll continue to make work.
And does it feel different what we're saying?
There are similar structures to the way how I make art, and the way, I guess, and so the manifestation, if you like, of what comes from that structure is the difference. But really, the core concerns and the way that I think about constructing things is similar. You just exchange different materials. So the layering, for example, is of course a primary way of constructing anything, whether that's materially, but first of all, it's the concepts that you tie together into an interrelated, and I usually draw out the mind map,
Right.
and then I'm able to piece out certain conglomerates of interconnected ideas, and then find the visual forms for each of those and layer them together.
Yeah.
So it's a similar mentality.
So the ideas and the concepts come first, and then the kind of material representation comes second?
Yes. Sometimes you produce an unknown space within the composition in order to force yourself to create a new language.
Yeah.
So that then that is the seedbed for a future painting or work, or maybe even an entire branch of work, such as these sculptures.
Yeah. And what was the seedbed for these paintings?
My interest in looking at the history of China, it became that much more important to me over the years to finally figure out why everybody keeps talking about it for a start, and also, of course, for personal reasons, to find out my own ancestry, living here in the UK, born here in the UK, not understanding what the handover meant in 1997, and what it means to be a colonial subject that was born in a different country to one that...
You're a colonizer.
I'm a colonizer. Is that what you said?
That's what your passport says.
Oh yes, yeah. In that case, yeah, I'm a complicit colonizer in that regard. And yeah, just understanding those sorts of contradictions, actually, and coming to terms with that as well.
But these remain, I mean, quite resolutely about the present in these works. And history maybe comes in with opium in the mountains and tradition, but not, say, in terms of similar systems in China, like telegraph wires, railways, the old-fashioned type, which were used for similar purposes as China was sort of inventing itself, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So things like Manifest Destiny was that iconic poster of an angel laying down telegraph lines while the pioneers are chasing away the Native American Indians because it was their right.
Yeah, so they were blocking progress.
And then
they were blocking progress.
And then they were blocking progress, because they didn't understand what it means to be civilized.
Yes.
Is the narrative. But yeah, no, there's all sorts of, there's the romantic language of mythologies, infused through the work as well. These experiences that are important, I think, to the human condition.
Yeah. So before we open up for questions from the audience, maybe we can finally come to the title of the show.
Oh, yeah, the Tears of Paradise.
Do you see that as a kind of negative or positive thing? It seems mixed, right?
It is, yeah. Because tears could be also tears.
Yeah.
So, and then the tears could be of joy or of sadness. In a way, I'm being ambiguous, of course, about it, because I'm opening it up to discussion to think about. Because as soon as you frame a work of art within a political forum, if you like, it becomes a very divisive issue. Everybody has very strong opinions about what something means in that context. And so, to lay down, if you like, facts, and then, then leave it open to discussion.
And to the point, as we said earlier, where maybe people don't get what the facts are.
No, I mean, I don't think in England or Britain they know that much about Opium Wars, or what the empire actually really did, to the world that they colonized.
Yes.
At what cost?
It made Britain great.
It did, and it had fabulous buildings as a result of slavery, militarized trade routes, and so on, for over hundreds and hundreds of years, and leaving a legacy that many are still recovering from.
Yeah.
So, these are extraordinary stories, and incredible systems of organization in order to achieve that at a human cost. And so Tears of Paradise is an ambiguous term. It's like, well, whose paradise is it? And and whose was it before? And who is crying over it, over joy or sadness, and who's tearing it up? Is some of the long-rooted historical questions that I'm interested in not only learning about, but figuring out and perhaps questioning and asking any of us whether this is what we want our humanity to actually represent.
Yeah, and I think these dynamics also implicate third parties as well. So the title reminded me, I was in a talk between a bunch of Indian artists and theorists and Chinese artists and theorists about the similarities the current urban conditions have and the kind of art that develops in terms of rapid urbanization. And it's all about, what they've got in common, until one moment when one of the Chinese speakers turns around and goes, "First you gave us Buddhism, then you gave us opium, you bastard."
Maybe that's a good place to ask questions.
So questions from Gordon? There's one at the back.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. It's really great to hear about your work. I'm really interested in the quality of the light in your paintings, with the light that they have is beautiful. I just wondered if you kind of thought together that process. For me, it kind of situates them in a kind of transitory place of creep dusk or dawn or twilight, which is that a hopeful thing for you in your work?
Oh, you've kind of touched on some of the many reasons as to why I depict light in the way that I do in the paintings. They're kind of like threshold spaces, and also they're like the golden hour, if you like. They only last for a certain period of time, and so they could be seen as a natural dawn or dusk light, maybe a nuclear glow. So there's this kind of ambiguous sort of depiction of what type of space these lights are trying to generate, and but also in reference to the neon landscapes through which we all exist, these artificial worlds that we've constructed on this epic scale, and so it's kind of building always a space in order to question the embedded narratives and symbols that are in the paintings.
Other questions?
Is there a reason for animal forms to appear? You don't allow human forms to appear in landscapes, but you allow animals to creep in every now and then.
Yeah, I do, yeah. So the animals are a symbol of nature. But many of them have mythological symbolism as well. So for example, a deer, messenger of gods. And it's a way again of depicting the different types of mythologies that we use or that are part of us as a culture, as a person, as an individual, as a tribe, as a nation. So they're, it depends on, each of those sorts of symbols depends on the nation as well. It's kind of, so Buddhism is prosperity.
It also has a resonance in Chinese literature. The term the mountains and the seas, for instance.
The mountains and the seas.
Yeah.
Mm.
Which is very particularly this kind of description of weird animals that the narrator meets as he travels through the country, which often have kind of supernatural powers.
Yeah, and that's probably related to like animism,
Yeah.
or animistic sort of beliefs in which a time in which our connection to nature was that much more, perhaps deeper, in respect to seeing that gods and creatures and spirits were actually in the landscape itself, whereas monotheistic sort of religions, they tend to detach that relationship between an inherent respect for landscape. It's more like that the land is for me to control because it's for me, it's been given to me. Whereas in animism or animistic type of beliefs, you have to, because if you anger the soil gods, for example, then you're not going to get a harvest next year.
Just one now.
I was curious, could you take us through kind of the like the sort of practice process or the just trial and error that you went through to, even from when you were kind of young to get to this sort of stage now? What is your sort of repetitive practice process, I guess, to...
You want to hear about the process
I
from
guess,
when I was a student, or?
I guess either from when you were a student or how you know, the thought that goes into making one of these, for example. Do you have studies that you work on? This kind of thing?
Yeah. So over the years, it has become much more complex in respect to how I make art. So when I was a student, I started as an abstract artist. So it's very much reducing everything, but maximalizing maybe the meaning into these minimal strategies. So for example, shredding stock listings of the Financial Times into all of abstract work. For me, a kind of reflection of the datascape in which we live in. And then over the years, I started constructing more languages and more ways of depicting the interest that I would have, which would shift from, say for example, just information landscapes on a global scale, utopias, dystopias, to things like trophy hunters as an extreme form of a consumer, through to today's sort of geopolitics of modern histories, through in reflection to histories written by victors. So for example, The Tears of Paradise is about the Opium Wars, and the whole show is kind of in some ways framed by the Century of Humiliation when China was attacked. And I'm sort of suggesting that many of these grand projects that they're undergoing is in response to that never happening again.
Just wondering, how do you think these works might translate into print work, or do they?
Yeah, I make prints, but
I know you make
Yeah.
prints, but I mean, because of the layering involved, and I'm just interested.
well, again, it just all you do is just change the technique with the multi-layered way in which I construct an image. So it begins on the computer, and so I can, and on the computer in Photoshop, it's built by layers. So you can go through multiple and very fast different images or compositions before you arrive at one in which you feel you can commit to. And then once you commit to that image, then you can, and during the time that you're constructing it, you're thinking about the different materials for each of those layers and how that might manifest in physical reality. And that includes colours as well, so you can keep changing the colours until it's right before you commit to. And then it becomes a different thing because the colour is never the same as on screen. So, and then you shift in and out until you don't feel you can do any more to it. So prints is the same. Prints, so I could just interchange each technique with a print technique.
There's a question in the middle.
Yeah, a detailed question really. China seems to have gone from, speaking of someone with very little knowledge in China, but it's gone from being a country that, or a civilization that changed barely at all in 1,000 years to one that's changed phenomenally in 100 years. So it's gone from one extreme to another.
Yeah.
So sort of putting your science fiction hat on, where do you see it going next? Is there going to be another extreme, or is this just going to, what do you...
Oh, you think that it was, they went through an extreme change because they were invaded.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
you know, and then they had to sort of throw out the ruling elite and
but the way that
re-establish.
change as a consequence of that has been phenomenal. The change has been faster
Yeah.
than anywhere else in the world, really.
Yeah.
Just wondering where you see...
No, I don't know. I'll be waiting to see what will happen as well. But so far, it seems, you know, if you look at like the projects that are happening, they're pretty crazy. It's just like more railway built than the entire world history, more roads built than the entire world history. You know, it's just the projects are totally crazy. 800 million people lifted from poverty. You know, these cities, like even with the coronavirus situation, 3 hospitals built in 10 days. You know, it's kind of, I don't know where that will lead, but it's interesting that some writers wrote about it as if it was a terrifying situation. You know, and that I find interesting as well. This kind of narrative of good versus evil, democracy versus communism, and. So I wouldn't know what's going to happen, but it's something that I'll probably be making paintings about as I continue to witness it.
But it's interesting this history of colonization of China isn't really taught in Chinese schools.
The Century of Humiliation, I think, is part of
But not as colonization. So it's attacks and battles.
Yeah, right. Is that how they depict it?
Yeah.
Okay. They don't talk about it as a semi-colonial. So they don't talk about.
Skirt around Japan like that.
They don't. So how do they talk about it as an occupation?
Yeah.
Right? But not colonization. Right. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. That's,
yeah, unpleasant fact. There was a question at the back that went up last.
What is it about the mist on the clouds, the landscape, the mountains, the back?
What's your thing with mist?
What's my thing with mists? It kind of dematerializes the physicality, if you like, of the image. Formally or technically allows me to blend spaces together. But it could also be read as a dust cloud, a sort of the glow of a light pollution. It could also be a natural mist. So it's a way of converging all those different sort of spaces between the natural and the artificial.
So there's a question in the middle.
Ezelina.
Yeah.
Thanks. The 12th century painting readers would often describe the act of painting as traveling while lying down, voyeur. And so you could envision and walk through the landscape while literally relaxing at leisure. I'm wondering, in your conceptualization of the 5 sacred mountains, presumably the Taoist ones, or the 5 Taoist mountains, whether you actually visited, or whether you sort of made up 5 mountain shapes, or whether you're lying down and traveling, or
It was Google Earth.
So you're actually looking at Marsom or Mount, these 5 mountains.
Yeah.
So you've never actually physically been there. It's fantastic.
No. So I flew in from Google Earth and found the right perspective.
Obviously there are many, but so you chose a perspective.
I chose the one that traditionally the emperor would visit. But yeah, there are multiple sets of sacred mountains in China, but that was the one that...
So you felt no need to actually, I mean, you don't need to, obviously, but this,
No.
this is part of the...
I couldn't possibly have visited the entirety of China as well. This is like, but maybe one day I will. Or over 70 nations of the One Belt, One Road.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Maybe not.
This is part of the fictional...
Maybe not after this show.
So this is part of the fictional history / mythology of the place, right? These places that are sacred that most people actually don't visit and take as given as sacred.
What do you mean?
Well, they're the 5 sacred mountains,
Yeah.
and we know where they are,
Yeah.
and the very, very few people actually make these pilgrimages.
Yeah. But culturally, as symbols, they resonate, right? So, of course, they're not sacred to everyone, but they are to the culture of China. So that was the aspect that I was interested in, the way how we develop certain mythologies or sacred ideas in order to bind us into a unified identity.
Do you need to take one last question in the corner?
If one looks at how China plans, it's on a completely different basis to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is very short term in terms of its politics, its economics, and especially in terms of military. There's a belief that actually China is planning on a 50-year basis. And then you say, when someone has asked, this is a comment on the present, and you're trying not to be critical, and it's like a photograph of what is now. And when the question was asked, what do you see the future as being? I see all of these as very futuristic. I'm inviting you to tell us what the future message is in your art, because there is a long-term planning thing going on.
Yes. I really don't know. I mean, it's just, I can't, a lot of I inject the existential questions of what does it mean throughout all of the paintings, precisely perhaps for that reason. These are enormously grand projects, but I wouldn't know where to start in respect to speculating about where this will all lead.
Is this the future of the world for you?
It's an aspect of the future of the world, yeah, but it's not it's one aspect. It's a large one, but there's lots of other things going on around the world as well.
I guess maybe the question would be, would you paint another aspect?
Yeah, I will be painting more about this subject. China's not the only subject that I've ever painted about or made work about. It is the one that, at the moment, I'm most interested and most involved in, for sure. But I can't answer what the future will be, I'm afraid. I can only sort of invite maybe you to speculate on it through these works.
People are frightened of China because of its momentum.
Yes.
And it seems unstoppable and completely oblivious to all the political systems outside it.
Yeah, I mean, who'd have thought that the most successful capitalists would be communists?
Well, they picked it up.
Huh?
They picked it up since.
Yeah.
So I see this as, unfortunately, a very sad future.
Well, I don't know whether it may be sad for the West, but I think for China they're quite happy, and maybe for those that have trade agreements with China that never had trade agreements with any other nations in all the times that they could have developed mutual trade. So from perhaps a Western point of view that has a long tradition of being the most powerful in the world, the potential rise, or some say the return, of China's 5,000-year history of civilization, I can see how that might be frightening to those that exist in what has been their privilege of being in a global hegemony.
I think a Chinese person might also find these landscapes slightly sad.
Chinese person might find it.
Yeah.
Well, you know, part of the work, you know, involves a symbol of the home.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm always trying to bring it down to a human scale. And what does it mean to exist within any civilization in some ways? You know, when your home can be demolished to create an idea of a nation home as well. So it's all of these are complicated questions, you know, moral mazes, you know, not only on a human scale but also through a geopolitical scale as well. So you know, looking at all the multiple moving parts of the different histories, and then what does it mean to exist within one of those, or any of those, is an ongoing, profound, compelling question that I try to weave together in order to think more about.
Well, thanks for answering all our questions. I'm sure they can be ongoing if people want to have a private moment. But thanks so much, Gordon. Thanks to the guys.